A lot of people in my life know that I have a fondness for movies. Maybe my enthusiasm for cinema hasn't been as high as it was a few years ago, when I would feverishly watch like 2 or 3 new releases a week, no matter if I thought they looked good, but I still love movies to death. The problem with loving movies, though, is that you either like pretty much every single motion picture that grazes your eyeballs, or most of those you watch don't leave any lasting impression. I'm sad to say that I fall in the latter camp. The more movies I watch, the harder I become to impress. When something is great, I'll shout its praises from the rooftops, but unfortunately, I'm more frequently met by mediocrity when it comes to new films. Thankfully though, with each passing year, I also become more appreciative of the films that were formative parts of my love for cinema. And that's not just a nostalgic gesture. Some movies become more personal to me because I really do think they're marvelous examples of movie magic. Even then, if someone were to ask me what my top 10 films of all time are, I don't know if I could come up with a confident answer. I do know what my absolute number 1 choice would be though. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you It's a Wonderful Life. 75 years ago, the world was given a lovely gift from Frank Capra, Jimmy Stewart, and everyone else who worked on this film. Nowadays, it is revered not only as a Christmas classic, but as one of the all-time great movies. Obviously, I share that sentiment because, like I just said, it's my favorite film. Rather than doing a straight review of the film though, I want to approach this video in the same way I do my favorite games series. In those videos, I focus more on why they mean so much to me on a personal level rather than just do a standard evaluation of their strengths and weaknesses, so that's what I will do here. Now in the past, my favorite film was the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a whole. I mean, not a bad pick, right? Nothing has changed in how much I love Peter Jackson's adaptation of Tolkien's books. It's a masterpiece of blockbuster filmmaking in its own right, and one that I would always be in the mood to watch. But it never quite sat right with me that this was my choice. Perhaps that could have been me just trying to be pretentious and pick something that wasn't a populist favorite. But eventually I came to the conclusion that It's a Wonderful Life, a movie I had always loved, was one that satisfied me above all others. I would hope that by watching this video, you may find a greater understanding as to why that's the case, but also what I hope to find in all movies I watch. After all, discovering that for myself has been a long journey over the years, and that journey eventually came to an end on December 20th, 2017. Keep in mind that I am going to be spoiling this movie pretty heavily from here on out, so consider this your warning in case you somehow haven't seen it. The date in question was when I saw It's a Wonderful Life on the silver screen for the first time. I went to the neighborhood Cinemark because it already was one of my favorite films to begin with, and I really enjoyed the idea of seeing classic films the way they were intended to be seen, and the experience was glorious. For one of the first times in my life, I actually shed some tears because of a friggin' movie. Yeah, I know, a cynical codger like me can actually cry from time to time. But why was this movie the one to elicit such a response from me? Well, there are a lot of reasons, some of which I will share with you, but they all stem from one very crucial thing. The movie does not waste any time. Have you ever heard of the principle of Chekhov's gun? Even if you have, I'm gonna tell you anyway. Let's say you introduce a gun in the first act of your story, and you make a point to do so. If you spent time establishing that this gun exists, then it should factor into the story sometime later, right? You'd be surprised by how many movies actually don't follow through on the threads they set up. But how does this apply to It's a Wonderful Life exactly? Well, let me put it this way. This movie is basically Chekhov's armory. To explain what I mean, let's look at the very unconventional way in which this movie is structured and paced. In standard storytelling terms, the point in which the story quote-unquote kicks off is called the inciting incident. It's the event that sets the story in motion. In most movies, this would occur sometime in the first 15 to 20 minutes of the story. But one could argue that for It's a Wonderful Life, that doesn't really happen until 80 minutes into the film when Uncle Billy accidentally hands over the $8,000 bank deposit to Mr. Potter. I mean, yeah, it's established right at the beginning that a man named George Bailey is in trouble since you overhear the prayers of many different people on his behalf, and then those prayers get carried up to the heavens when we start to hear some men in the cosmos conversing about him. But that's not exactly the moment when the conflict is formally established. What unfolds from the opening moments is not a jump right into the event that's causing such a heavenly commotion, but we're transported right into a montage of scenes from George Bailey's life, starting with childhood childhood and leading gradually into his adult years. And for those next 70 minutes or so leading up to the inciting incident, we're spending that time just learning about who George Bailey is and what he's experienced. If you want to put it in storytelling terms, it's a series of expository events that could almost make up their own entire film. Present this idea for structuring a story to a film executive today, and they'd probably spit in your face before security drags you out to the pavement. But miraculously, writer-director Frank Capra somehow used all of this time to his advantage. Whereas other movies would falter in keeping their audience engaged without a progressing plot, per se, It's a Wonderful Life manages to be really entertaining before the plot is set in motion. This film may have been canonized as a Christmas classic, but really, less than half of its runtime takes place during Christmas. It gets by because it's genuinely funny, the dialogue and character interactions strike a fine balance between classic Hollywood while maintaining an aura of authenticity. Each scene is paced perfectly, and Jimmy Stewart's George Bailey is possibly the most relatable everyman you can think of. Watching his life unfold is the exact opposite of boring. It's just as fulfilling to watch the first half of this movie as the much more discussed second half. That goes beyond the fact that these scenes are really fun to watch though. Remember how I was talking about Chekhov's gun earlier? That principle courses through this movie's bloodstream, because literally every single scene matters. Even the most seemingly minute details all have their place. But what I love about this movie is that it tries to not blow any of these scenes out of proportion. It treats these events in the same way they would register to George, so the audience is right there with him. Whether or not the event in question is something major like George suddenly losing his father, promising that he would lasso the moon for Mary, saving his kid brother Harry when he fell into the frozen pond, or helping Martini come up with the funds for a mortgage, details don't go overlooked here. After all, if they were, the third act could not be anywhere near as effective as it has been for generations of film fans across the globe. Knowing the disappointment George endured throughout his life, we're keenly aware that he hates running the building alone, resents the fact that he never got to go to college or travel the world, he never got to go on a honeymoon with Mary because of the stock market crash, and George is essentially stuck in a perpetual state of monotonous existence. That's why we completely understand the desperate panic and emotional turmoil he feels upon realization that Uncle Billy lost the money. He already detested his life, but now his business is gonna fail, his family will be destitute, people he helped may lose their homes, and he'll be sent to jail for misappropriation of funds. Truly, Mr. Potter couldn't have condemned George Bailey in a more savage way than saying,
"Look at you. You used to be so cocky. You were going to go out and conquer the world. You once called me a warped, frustrated old man. What are you but a warped, frustrated young man? Miserable little clerk crawling in here on your hands and knees and begging for help. No securities, no stocks, no bonds, nothing but a miserable little $500 equity and a life insurance policy. You're worth more dead than alive."
As we all know, George almost took that terrible statement with him to a watery grave, only to be saved by an act of divine grace once angel in training Clarence intervenes. So now we come to the roughly 30 to 40 minute sequence that has made this movie famous. If the movie started at this point, I'm sure that Frank Capra or someone else could have made the story work, but they probably would have had to rely on a lot of intermittent flashbacks to make up for lost time. Like, imagine if Clarence took George to the cemetery in Pottersville to show him Harry's grave, and then suddenly the movie was like, okay, now let's go back to what happened between George and Harry in the past. Wouldn't that just interrupt the pacing and emotion of what's taking place here and now? So even though It's a Wonderful Life relies quite heavily on the setup of its first half, this choice allows all of the emotional moments to have a sense of immediacy and importance to them. That goes for every scene in the film, not just the third act. An acute attention to detail not just in the dialogue, but also in all aspects of the set design, costuming, and performances, especially Jimmy Stewart, really sell the paranoia George Bailey feels when Clarence sets him loose in an existential nightmare where he witnesses a world without him in it. Literally all of that prior investment suddenly gets rewarded back to the audience in these last 30 or so minutes, because the audience member who's been paying attention will clue into all of the things absent in this warped reality that were all affected by George Bailey's life. and it's fantastic. I can't even imagine what watching this for the first time would feel like, since even watching it now after having viewed it countless times, I still think this climax is one of the most intense sequences of suspense I've ever experienced in a movie. George Bailey very quickly goes from wanting to end it all to being reminded that life is worth living even if it means getting sent to prison, and it culminates in this magical turning point.
Clarence! Clarence! Help me, Clarence! Get me back! Get me back! I don't care what happens to me! Get me back to my wife and kids! Help me, Clarence, please! Please! I want to live again! I want to live again! I want to live again. Please, God, let me live again.
You know, when this movie first came out in 1946, a lot of people didn't warm up to it. World War II may have ended in victory for the United States, but at an absolutely catastrophic cost of human life. For those who endured it and returned home, there was much misery and cynicism that pervaded the nation in the wake of mourning, and perhaps even worse, debilitating mental health amongst veterans. Jimmy Stewart, a veteran of the war himself, was one such person to endure a lot of post-war pain. He may have been one of the very few movie stars who eagerly enlisted in the military at the time, and he honorably served many combat missions as a pilot in the European theater, but the war left a devastating effect on him. You know that scene where George Bailey thrashes around in his house with Mary and the kids watching? He was pretty much having a post-traumatic episode on camera. The same could be said of the scene when his character is giving a tearful prayer while seated in Martini's bar. It's also gone on record that Jimmy Stewart severely doubted his acting abilities and considered quitting Hollywood while this film was in production, since this was his first role after the war. Yet, he helped pull off this incredible ending. It's about as perfect of a conclusion that any filmmaker could ask for. In fact, it is a perfect ending. My favorite out of any other movie I've seen, and it's all because Frank Capra trusted his cast, crew, and audience to play along with a carefully constructed story where everything matters. But beyond that, you could say that in a way, this film saved many lives. For one thing, it saved Jimmy Stewart, providing a therapeutic outlet for him to confront his post-war demons with something so authentically inspiring. It's not surprising that he considered this to be his favorite role of his entire career. More than that, though, It's a Wonderful Life has saved countless other lives throughout the years. I can't pretend to know what others have gone through in getting to the verge of committing suicide, for I've thankfully never found myself in that severe of a mental state. But I've had my fair share of days feeling hopeless and completely devoid of self-worth, relating deeply to the struggles George Bailey had in that his life paled in comparison to what he hoped it would be. Seeing him organically make a 180 and then discover the outpouring of unconditional love from his family and friends, simply because he is a good person, is exactly as rewarding as you might expect. More so than any other story I've encountered in my lifetime, It's a Wonderful Life has taught me that life does have value, and where that value comes from. The message isn't overly sappy, sentimental, or cloying. It comes from a narrative that takes its time setting up this powerful conclusion, earning every single emotional response intended. So many other movies, even the great ones, have failed to forge that sacred connection since they lack the willpower to make their stories completely cohesive, but more importantly, matter. Let It's a Wonderful Life serve as a benchmark for how films should be judged, because while it is a marvelous achievement in filmmaking, it is just a perfectly told story, even with how differently said story is told. I apologize to all of you out there who haven't seen this and suddenly got a lot of story events spoiled for you, but if you haven't made this a part of your Christmas movie traditions, fix that immediately. Like, seriously, go watch this right now and discover why it's one of the greatest films of all time. Who knows, maybe you'll find that I overhyped it to oblivion and just move on with your life once it ends. But no matter what, know that you are loved and that someone out there is watching out for you. Keep your head up high, treat others with kindness, and do good to your fellow man. Maybe things aren't looking up for you right now, but things will change. You will find the happiness you're seeking after, just like how George Bailey and myself did, and when it does, may you treasure it forevermore. Merry Christmas, everyone. May God bless and keep you all.
Christmas present from a very dear friend of mine.
Look, Daddy, teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings.
That's right. That's right. Attaboy, Clarence.